Hello, good afternoon, good morning for those over in North America. Good evening to anyone who's stayed up late in Asia to tune into this. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Nick Chubb. This is another Thetius research launch. We're really excited to be able to put out into the market this research on high frequency data in the maritime industry, and we're hugely thankful to our partners from Danelec for actually commissioning the research in the first place. Just to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing over the next hour or so, I will be first off just taking us through a brief overview of the research from data to action, unlocking the value of high frequency data to enhance safety and achieve ship performance goals. It will be a pretty brief summary. This is a pretty in-depth piece of research that we've done. I think the final report's about 40-50 pages long. It's packed full of interesting case studies and ideas, and I would definitely recommend after this session, if you haven't already, because it came out a little bit earlier on today, sit down with a cup of coffee and give it a good read. Then we will move on to a panel discussion where we'll actually discuss the research findings and dive into the implications of what it means for the industry. And of course, we want you to be involved with the discussion. So you can see on the bottom of your Zoom panel there is a Q&A function. What always happens in our sessions is no one asks any questions at the beginning of the Q&A, and then far too many people ask questions for us to be able to answer them towards the end. So what I would do is encourage you, just if you think of something that you're curious about or a point you want to make as the discussion's going, or even as I'm talking through the original presentation, just pop it into the Q&A box. If it's really interesting, I might just go ahead and ask it straight away. Otherwise, we have some dedicated time towards the end for Q&A. All right, well, let's jump into it, shall we? First things first, perhaps just a bit of a thought experiment for anyone who is involved in operating ships day to day. I'd just be interesting to have a bit of a think about how many decisions are made during each 24-hour period on or around the ship in terms of how that ship is operated. We reckon it goes into the hundreds of decisions a day, both taken ashore and at sea, about how that ship is operated, ways to improve the performance. But actually, a lot of those decisions get taken based on outdated information. We don't really do it in any other sector of our lives. The kind of analogy that I like to use is it's a bit like running your finances based on a single bank statement at the end of the month, whereas most people these days are working to instant push notifications whenever a transaction goes through on their bank, and you just have a much clearer understanding of where you're at and can make decisions easier throughout the period rather than waiting till the end of the month to sort of find out where you're at. So we're in this age that's dominated by instant communication. We work in one of the world's most critical transport sectors, and we rely in a pretty significant way. 70% of vessels today rely on manually implemented, inputted noon reporting data. A big part of this research was to look into exactly how to overcome that, what that means, both the good and the bad of moving from manually inputted data to high frequency data, and then ultimately come out with some recommendations to ship owners. So what I'm going to do is just take you through the high level findings of the research and why it's important to look at this question around high frequency data, and then go into some best practice around how to go about implementing it. First, what actually is it? What is the difference between high frequency data and low frequency data? Low frequency data, generally speaking, is submitted manually, generally speaking, submitted once per day and possibly less. And the perfect example of that is noon report data. But there's a whole host of other examples around a vessel where you may be submitting data possibly daily, weekly, or even monthly, depending on the piece of equipment that's being monitored. By contrast, high frequency data is collected at a second or even millisecond intervals. It's submitted automatically and continuously throughout the day. and it can include measurements from a whole different range of sensors, both including sensors that relate to the movement of the vessel, but also to equipment on board the vessel as well. The major benefit of low frequency data, first off, is that it's cheap to implement, and it's relatively easy to store and to manage. And it is good, and we've been working with Noon reports for hundreds of years, so it's good for assessing historical performance and identifying kind of long-term trends. So it absolutely has purpose and value, and I think one of the key things that we found out of this research process and all of the interviews that we've conducted is that low frequency data and Noon reports they're not going anywhere. It is actually a genuinely very valuable historical benchmark. But the kind of key difference is that high frequency data can provide much more detailed information on the vessel, how the vessel is interacting with the water that it's moving through, on fuel consumption across a whole range of different speeds and conditions. It doesn't aim to provide an average over a day. It's about providing insight into the performance of the vessel in actual conditions in as close to real time as possible. What can we actually do with it? It's not just about the speed and consumption data. There's a huge amount of information and insight that can be extracted from high frequency data, depending on how the setup is pulled together. So things like monitoring hull performance, real-time fuel consumption, how that feeds into your charter party agreements. Obviously, all of that has a big impact on fuel consumption and ultimately on performance of the charter. And so there's an immediate ROI question there, but possibly some of the other things that are talked about less that we've uncovered is being able to do things like predictive maintenance in a meaningful way, moving towards automated regulatory either compliance or reporting. So things like moving in and out as ECAs and SECAs, switching fuels, how all of that gets reported, DCS reporting, EUMRV reporting. We've kind of moved, I would say, the industry, generally speaking, has moved from an operating mode where it matters what you're consuming, but the detail doesn't necessarily matter a huge amount, to where we are today increasingly through regulation is that right down to the absolute detail, every calorie of fuel being burned and how that's being burned is becoming increasingly important to monitor, because it has real world implications beyond just the commercial performance of the vessel, also around how that is translating into the cost of emitting carbon. Couple of interesting case studies that we pulled together, and I'd recommend go and have a read in the research. But some of the ones that stuck out to me, one is that there was a vessel that had a Noon reported speed of the last 24 hours of 17 knots, which was roughly speaking the recommended speed for the voyage. But actually, that didn't tell the full picture, and there was a difference between how the vessel was being operated in the day versus how the vessel was being operated at night. The daytime speed of the ship was about 17.3 knots, and the nighttime speed of the ship was 15.6 knots. So over 24 hours, it averaged out at 17 knots, the recommended speed. But actually, at no point was the recommended speed actually being hit by the ship. It was either going over and burning 49 metric tons of fuel a day, or going under and burning 37 metric tons, and then having to go over to catch up. That's the sort of fidelity of information and insight that you just can't get from Noon reporting data alone. And as the kind of regulatory pressure ratchets up on the industry, and the commercial pressure too, being able to take a kind of up to the minute look of how a ship is performing is becoming increasingly important. On the machinery side, another sort of interesting fact that came out of the research for me was actually that machinery failures account for about 35% of serious vessel losses. And so setting up some kind of predictive maintenance system that allows you to get a better understanding of how the vessel or how machinery on board the vessel is performing, and how that performance is degrading over time is key to be able to being able to get ahead of that and improve safety on board. So it's not all it's not a panacea. If we set up or move to high frequency data, there's actually a lot of challenges that come with it. So it's not a case that this is something that you can just install and go on your way. There is a huge amount of work sort of around the periphery that needs to be done to actually make any kind of system installation like this a success. So the core ones, we've split them into three areas, which we dive into in the research: technical challenges, operational challenges, and then cultural challenges. On the technical side, there's huge issues with actually sensor absence and inaccuracy. And actually, one of the things that we found is that the more this high frequency data gets looked at and examined, the more quickly you're able to establish if a sensor is reporting inaccurately. If you're taking irregular readings from a sensor, it's almost impossible to understand how accurate that sensor may or may not be. System interoperability, but that's both on the vessel, how you get data from one point to another on the vessel, but then also once it comes off the vessel, how you're able to move that data between systems is absolutely a challenge. And I think we can talk. We could do a whole other session on issues around standardization of noon reporting, for example. And data bandwidth is another technical challenge that's obviously starting to come down as the likes of Starlink and OneWeb rise in prominence, but it's absolutely not something that's entirely gone away. On the operational side, there is an upfront cost to bringing any system like this in, and that cost, I think, has previously been prohibitive for some ship owners. I think we're now getting to the point where there's a bit of a tipping point where the benefits are beginning to outweigh, or the financial benefits are beginning to outweigh those costs, and the investment is becoming near enough the minimum so that you're able to report properly. From a compliance standpoint, I think we'll move in the next 12 to 18 months to a point where this becomes a sort of minimum license to operate. There are absolutely concerns around cybersecurity. With all of this stuff, you are effectively networking a lot of operational technology into a network, which has a whole load of knock-on impacts that need to be thought about carefully and considered. And of course, it is a change of workflow. It's a change of how data gets moved around the ship, off the ship, and how that data gets distributed through the organization. It is all a bit of a change. On the cultural side, principally around that workflow disruption, we see that there is a huge amount of resistance to change that can come up when these projects start to happen. Actually, getting a buy-in from just the internal stakeholders within a team can be quite challenging. You also have issues of the potential misalignment of stakeholders outside of the organization as well, where you may have a ship owner and a charterer that may have slightly misaligned incentives. So it does require a bit of a shift in approach and a bit of a change in how you think about this stuff. And then finally, there are challenges around this, just a pure skills gap. We're talking about working with quite advanced technologies, and it will take time to get people upskilled to the point where they are comfortable with them. However, there are a huge number of opportunities that come with getting this stuff right, and to pick out a few of them. When you get to the point where there is some high frequency data coming through, being able to build out those data standards that enable you to transmit that data to internally and externally, I think becomes that much easier. There are absolutely long-term cost savings to be had through the efficiency gains that you would get, both from an equipment on board point of view, but also from a fuel consumption point of view. And that ultimately impacts the ROI, and that's both a financial ROI, but also a kind of ROI on the cultural change that needs to happen to make your organization more data driven. So if you're interested in this topic, our first recommendation is obviously to go and download the report and dive into it in a bit more detail. But there were 4 things that we hit upon that we thought were the most important things to consider if you were looking at how to implement high frequency data. First is actually just to understand the individual roles of low frequency data and high frequency data within your organization, and how they may work together, how they may integrate. As I said, noon reporting isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and there are other forms of low frequency data that are hugely important to the operation of a ship. But the high frequency data also has a new role to play, and so actually understanding where you want to use high frequency data in the first instance, to have an ROI as quickly as possible, I think is really important to get that right from the outset. Second is this whole question around sensors and sensor health. I mentioned earlier about when you've got a high frequency data setup, it becomes easier to spot when sensors are possibly coming out of calibration, or need to be replaced. It's critical that you are able to maintain the health of sensors that exist throughout the ship, and it's not just a case of kind of set it and forget it with these types of systems. There is a kind of ongoing program of maintenance and updating sensors to be able to maximize the benefits of it. It's really important to work with vendors that are capable of handling multiple data types, and I would say work with vendors who have some specialist expertise in terms of getting data off a vessel, because it is a complicated thing. And 4, I think, is actually the most important, and it comes up in all of the research we do. This question comes up around culture and change management. That is, if you want a high frequency data implementation program to fail, it will fail based on culture and change management, and people not being willing to change their approach to things. As I say, that is a whistle-stop tour through the research and through these questions. But what I'm pleased to be able to do now is bring in some real experts on this topic. Duncan and Mike, welcome. Perhaps we could just start, maybe Duncan, with yourself. Just give us a bit of an introduction to who you are, and your background, and then perhaps your first impressions of the research.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm happy to. First, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really happy that you've organized this panel discussion. This is a topic very near to me. I spend a lot of time very close to all kinds of data, both LFD, like noon-based data, and sensor-based data coming off of these vessels. So I have a lot of I spend a lot of time thinking about this. So I'm the principal data scientist at Danelec. I oversee the development of machine learning and AI assets across the organization. Although I have a special interest in ship performance and optimization of vessel operations. I've been a data scientist for coming on 10 years now. I'm formally trained as an astrophysicist. I was a research scientist for quite a while before moving into the data science field. And I'm very excited to talk about this with you guys. And maybe I'll pass it along to Mike to introduce himself.
Thank you so much, Duncan.
Mike.
I'm Mike. I'm the group head of ICT and cybersecurity for TMS. We're a ship owner and ship manager of almost 140 vessels from different sectors, from LNG, LPG to tankers and dry and bulkers, with a crew list of more than 5,000 people and almost other 700 in the office. I saw the research was amazing and very to the point, very targeted. And I think that the success of this research is that it's very easy to read from people that are not so technical, because now all these projects doesn't have to do only with technology, but also with business transformation, with cultural changes, and at the end of the day, with people. So from technology side, we're creating infrastructures and tools that are going to be utilized and used by people that are not so much in technology, but they're in shipping operation. So I think that this research very, very easy to read, and it's trying to connect these two different words.
Perhaps we should start there in that case, Mike, because you raised a really interesting point, and I'm going back to the recommendations from the report. That change management piece, I think, is really important. Maybe you could start by just talking us through what is the sort of business transformation that you are undertaking at TMS, and what are some of the things you've learned about that that kind of cultural and change management piece.
We are the interesting thing here is that until last year in TMS, we are operating like we are three different companies. So we have created three different cultures for dry bulker sector, different culture for LNG, LPG, and different culture for tankers. And we have seen that there were inconsistencies in terms either of technology on board, either on shipping operation, and also in culture. During the last year, and most focused on this year, we're trying, to fill this gap and try to invest in technology on board all these sectors. So we have a project related with transform our low frequency data strategy to high frequency data. And, we have seen that starting relevant projects, we need to engage the management of the company, so the owner of the company, and we need to assign some roles to the business leaders that are going to utilize this system. So we need, first of all, to identify the case study that we would like to start with, and also assign roles and parts of the project to the business owner of each sector. We need first to make them not not be afraid of the change, not be afraid of the new technology, and convince them that this is the time to invest in technology, because although the maritime company is doing extremely well, they're not very familiar to invest in technology, especially on board the vessel. Now that the vessels are becoming more extrovert due to connectivity and regulation requirements, I think it's the right time to talk about an investment in technology that will transform the processes of the shipping operation, and that will engage more people to utilize the results of this kind of transformation. It's very difficult for the old captains or the old engineers or the superintendents to stop utilizing emails or Excels or things like that with new platforms, with business intelligence tools, or with analytics. So you need to invest time in the people factor as well.
Duncan, Mike talked about kind of finding that first case study where you can get some ROI quickly. I think that's a really interesting point, because there's so many directions you could go in this topic. In your experience, what are some of the areas where it's possible to kind of get to that ROI, or kind of what are the low-hanging fruit where you would recommend a ship owner to start looking at this?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, and I think the report does a good job in laying out the various areas where low frequency data and high frequency data impact your ability to pull value from those data sources. And you gave one example of this in the report and your introduction to the report earlier today, talking about vessel operational insight, right? You can see the vessel was going faster during the day and slower during the night, and that's something you would just miss with low frequency data. And from that, it's very straightforward to calculate associated savings with that. And that's exactly one way that you can look and calculating ROI. The other really important thing to consider is it really depends how you're using your data right now. So, for example, if you're not doing a machine learning AI-based voyage optimization, and HFD data enables you to do that, there's a lot of savings on the table that could easily be millions of dollars per vessel per year, depending on how it's operating prior to this. So yeah, the unlocking new tools and insights has direct savings associated with that, and the way we think about that are exactly looking at case studies like this. So like typical savings when you start to monitor different systems using HFD data, or if you start to use voyage optimization. Those are numbers that are pretty straightforward to supply. The other way to go about doing this is if you are already invested in a data platform, like Danelec, right? We do ingest low frequency data and noon-based data, in addition to HFD systems. And if you're already invested in this kind of environment, you can take a vessel, upgrade it so it has new HFD systems, and do before and after studies, right? You can really do counterfactuals. Like prior to this change, we could see the vessels operating in this way. After the change, we could, we identified these various inefficiencies, and the associated cost with that is X. So what I take from that is like the time is now. Even if you don't have sensors installed on a vessel, you should invest in a modern data system, right? Your data should be in a cloud. You should have analysis tools based around that. And that really unlocks visibility into the kind of savings you're likely to see when you upgrade to modern HFD systems.
That's interesting. So it's not necessarily about going for a major rollout across a fleet of a huge amount of hardware. It's actually first, have you got the data platform in place that allows you to start asking these types of questions? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, that's right. The data platform is key, right? If you could invest a ton of money in HFD systems and get very little in return for that if you don't use that data to do something, right? You need to ask questions and monitor it, and that's what data platforms really enable. And I think it's important to note that you don't have to take a full fleet HFD all in one step. That's a really big investment and a really big step, and there's a lot of cultural changes involved in doing that. I think incremental change is very valuable, and is a good way to confirm that the ROI is worth it to start rolling out to the rest of the fleet.
What was your experience like, Mike, in getting buy-in from management and from the owners of the organization to start making these investments? Because I think, based on what Duncan's saying, once you get going and get the first investments made, it gets easier to start to prove the ROI of this stuff, and then you can get kind of build it up bigger. But when you're making that first business case, what are the sorts of things that your management were looking for?
I think that the principle, the pillars of an owner or a manager is to decrease the risk, to be regulation oriented, to optimize efficiency and reduce costs. So at the end of the day, I strongly agree with Duncan that you need to provide them the opportunity to identify how the efficiency will be optimized in terms of the current status without the visibility that we have on board, that in the regulation part, it will be 100% regulated, and all this kind of technology will provide more transparency between the regulators, the charterers, the clients, and the shipping owners. And in terms of ROI, I think that predictions and having visibility on the abnormalities at the end of the day will provide money, which is what it counts for all the ship owners and the management in terms of fuel savings, cost reduction from maintenance things, cost savings from regulatory compliance. And maybe we should try to start to measure how efficient are the employees that are utilizing the current data of the company. What are the functions that they are doing in order to identify if something goes wrong on board the vessel, versus of having the clear picture of a vessel on a platform. So I think that it's pretty easy to understand why and why now. And I strongly agree with Duncan that the time is now. Not only because the technology is different, not only because the connectivity is different, but because we have started talking about autonomous vessels. Before going to autonomous, we need to have visibility. Then we need to have automation, and then we need to discuss about autonomous functions on board the vessels.
You see this as a kind of foundational step in that direction that I take it, Mike. You mentioned connectivity there, and that's a really interesting one. Do we need to have the likes of Starlink for these sorts of systems to be able to function? Mike, what's your connectivity setup within your fleet? And then Duncan, I'd be interested to hear what the kind of range of different connectivity types you have across your client base.
We have Starlink on board the whole fleet of 140 vessels. Not only about we need it for system maintenance, for vessel maintenance and systems related with the shipping corporation, but also for crew welfare. Connectivity provides us an advantage almost to be on board the vessel. So it's not only for technology, for IT reasons, but also, it unlocks the ability for the other departments like operation or technical or environmental to have a clear view on board, on the systems on board, in order to analyze and identify relevant data. Because before having this kind of connectivity, we rely only on the human element. We didn't have a clear view of what is happening on board. So I think that connectivity plays a significant role. It was a game changer for the maritime industry. It provides us the ability to do a lot of things, also things without data.
And Duncan, is that the same across your client base? Is everyone sort of moving in that direction? And what does that enable? And perhaps for those who aren't quite there yet, are there still opportunities to leverage high frequency data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that's the future. I think having connection to shore and getting data off of vessels into the cloud into a really unified data environment provides the most value. That's not to say that there's not value even if data stays on the vessel. So Danelec also provides on-vessel performance monitoring systems that gives the crew that's operating the vessel much more granular insight into the condition and the operational efficiency. So even if you're not moving data off the vessel, there's still value to HFD. That being said, Danelec also is instrumental in getting data off the vessel into the cloud, and that does require connectivity. But even there's room to play, right? You could be moving data off from microseconds, right? There's quite a bit of data if you're collecting data multiple times per second for a large number of sensors. But lower frequency data, not maybe minute or hourly, is also very, very valuable. And there's lower bandwidth requirements for that. So again, there's various levels to which you can move if you're not quite ready to go microsecond data to the cloud immediately. The connectivity, though, the thing that it immediately unlocks, which I think Mike's alluding to and as discussed in the report, is really real-time insight into how the vessel is operating. So if there is a problem, it can be immediately noticed and hopefully corrected.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of comes back to the kind of whole crux of the kind of voyage optimization piece is that just taking a look once a day is just not going to get you to the level of detail you need to fully optimize how the ship's performing. Could we talk about the cybersecurity side of things? Because effectively we're talking about networking, potentially lots of different OT technologies on board into one place. Duncan, what's been your experience in handling the kind of cyber risk? And is there any advice you'd give to ship owners who are watching who are worried about these cyber questions?
Yeah, I think it's really critical to work with a trusted partner in this. I recommend looking at cybersecurity certifications. That should be very clear when you're deciding on a data partner to work with. And it's certainly prioritized by Danelec and any other reputable data provider and analyst should be willing to prove that to you. But it's definitely something to keep in mind. And I think a good reason that you should work with an experienced operator rather than trying to do something in-house if you don't have experience with that prior.
Yeah, makes a huge amount of sense. And Mike, on the kind of ship owning side, what are the sorts of steps you're taking when it comes to implementing these systems to ensure they're cyber secure? Is it relying on the vendor, or are there other things you're doing in-house as well?
You need to know your third party that you will that will join in this kind of journey, and you need to have the same culture in terms of cybersecurity. For sure, the attack surface will be increased. You need to be very careful in the kind of access that anyone will have, and either on board or on the actual data, whenever they're located, either in the cloud or on the premises. You need to be able to identify all the legacy systems with outdated software that are there on board and will be a part of the project, because we have seen in the industry that there are a lot of majors that are still using Windows XP to have its operation, unfortunately, on board. So all the third-party risk exposure need to be identified and handled by the vendors that they will participate in the project. This is the supply chain security, as we say, and of course you need to have your partner vendor to be fully regulated and compliant with the relevant standard. Define the process and follow all the security processes in terms, again, of accessing the data, because this is very, very important. And it's just another day in the office. Further to that, and it's not that you need to securitize the vendor that will join the project of the high frequency data, but any vendor, any major that is on board and having access to your infrastructure.
Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense. I think it's very, very sound advice. Thank you. I can see questions starting to come in, which is great. We will turn to those in just a few minutes, in about 5 minutes time. So if you do want to ask a question, now is the time to get it in. Before we turn to the questions, though, I would just like to ask about the kind of wider set of stakeholders that perhaps might exist around this. And I can totally see the logic of when you start to move in this direction, the kind of close to instant ROIs you might start to see on things like fuel optimization. But what about the kind of wider set of stakeholders that are involved in the either operational management or chartering of the ship? When we've got all of this data coming into a single platform, Duncan, I don't know whether you've seen any ways that data has then been shared with third parties that's been able to drive value in other ways. What's your experience of that been?
Yeah, that's another great question, right? So there's the very typical situation where there needs to be some secure but open data sharing between charterers and owners potentially. That's something that we often enable, of really isolating the data set that a charterer can see to the relevant time period, so they're not sharing proprietary data unintentionally. That's something we think of from the very beginning. Otherwise, like other stakeholders, right? The stakeholders could be quite broad. So there's onshore teams, but there's also the crew on board, and I think that's really important to keep in mind, right? Vessels are operated by humans, and we can have really advanced insights on shore, but that needs to be communicated, and trust needs to be built with the experts that are operating these vessels. So, building trust, showing what the data looks like, providing analysis in a very clear, straightforward way is more than half the value, I think, right? So you can have a whole bunch of data, but if it's raw tags shown at the microsecond level and you're not even sure exactly what things are, that's at least leaving a lot of value on the table. So making it digestible, making it understandable, standardizing it, and integrating data sources really makes it so a variety of individuals, both technical experts, crew members, business, different business departments can understand the insights.
That's really interesting, because I can see one of the drawbacks, if it's not handled correctly, of HFT is just the kind of full data overwhelm that you may end up with. And actually, as Mike said right at the top about perhaps non-IT people wanting to engage in this stuff, you need to translate the data or make it available in a way that you're perhaps just putting the right insight in front of people rather than just sending huge amounts of data. Mike, what's your view on this?
Also, I'm 100% with Duncan. Also, it can provide a very advanced level of training and mentoring for the personnel on board. It's very difficult for the companies to find crew where the crew, is exchanging every 3, 4, 6 months to have the same culture. These kind of platforms and the data visualization and analysis can lead to have the same training and the same mentoring on the same platform for the data of the vessel to different people. So with technology, you can not only be advanced or innovative, but you start having a common language with your employees as well.
That's fascinating, because I think that comes back to that cultural question that we talked about right at the top, in terms of how you bring people through that cultural change. And actually what you're saying is these platforms potentially create a common language for everyone to coalesce around. It's really, really interesting. Let's move to Q&A. There's some really interesting questions come in already. So there is still time to post a question if you want to ask one, but I'll dive right in at the top. I'm not actually sure who to direct this to, so I'll read it out and then either of you can volunteer. How should a ship owner think about this in relation to OEMs, particularly in relation to proprietary sensors or data collected by those sensors, and ownership or use rights of the data collected? Stunned silence. Go on, Duncan.
It's a tough one. I'm hoping maybe Mike has some insight. Yeah, I would say that as a ship owner, you should be certain that you understand those rights from the beginning. It's your vessel. It should be your data to do with as you like, and potentially in contract with a charter on how that data is shared. But it is important to, I think, understand that from the beginning.
Mike, how do you handle that with your OEMs?
All the ship owners and the ship managers, as ship owner and ship managers, I need to own everything, technology, data, everything on board the vessel. But I think that the culture of the majors has changed. I think that now they're more open to discuss about all this proprietary, either hardware or software that they're utilizing. I think that you need from the start to have a clear view of the data ownership and access rights. The vendor needs to be open in relevant API integrations, because all the system without integration cannot provide the value that we think they can. We need to be very, very careful with data privacy. That's why, my advice is that the legal department should be a part of this project, because data is a very critical asset. We need to know that. And maritime, before all this technology, business transformation, Starlink, was very, very introvert in terms of data and in terms of what was happening on board the vessel. So now is the time, to negotiate from the start and create all the guidelines that the companies need and define clear barriers about the ownership and the privacy of this data.
I think those are really interesting points. I think from our perspective, this is not legal advice, but certainly what we tend to see is that if you own the asset, the equipment that's on board, you should own the data that comes out of that asset. But one thing that often gets sort of tripped up is, and Mike, you mentioned about integrations. it's one thing to own the data, but if you can't actually integrate it into anything, then it's totally the value of it is totally lost. And we've certainly seen, and we have sort of anecdotal evidence of OEMs charging 5 figures just to switch on an API. And so there are all sorts of ways that you can end up with kind of data stuck in a particular place and not able to integrate it or use it. So I fully agree and would back the advice to make sure that your legal department has sight of this sort of stuff when you're right at the beginning of speccing out a project. Another question here is how is ROI calculated for a high frequency data project? We've talked a little bit about that in the round, but Duncan, have you got any advice on sort of how to turn this into a sort of dollars and cents calculation?
Yeah, right. I think I mentioned that in the best case scenario, right, where you're already on a data platform, you're moving from an LFD environment to HFD environment. The kind of gold standard for this return on investment analysis will be, what was the operational efficiency prior to the change and after the change. That's not always possible, right? It's not always possible that you have that data available. Then the question is, can we provide kind of after the fact counter analysis to estimate the return on investment? And this is the kind of thing where these case studies are really valuable, right? These can be reproduced for the specific data from a client for their specific fleet to provide estimates. That being said, I don't think the margins are close here, right? There's huge amounts of money being left on the table moving from a low frequency data like operation profile to an HFD one. Just in voyage optimization alone, right? We'd be talking tens of thousands of dollars per voyage per vessel. So spread across a fleet, it's very easy to see that this adds up to many millions of dollars over its lifetime. And that is so much larger than the costs on these data platforms, as long as the hardware is in place.
Just as a follow-on to that, Duncan, what would you say to a ship owner who says, "Yeah, okay, I'm going to make all of these investments," but then it's actually the charterer that's going to see the benefit in the fuel savings, and I won't see any of that because the market is ultimately dictating the rate that the ship gets. Is there how have you seen ship owners overcome that, if at all?
Yeah, this is a really big challenge in the whole industry. I think there's some incremental progress here. I think to first order, right, one, so ship owners themselves should be interested in this, if only to monitor the equipment and performance of the ship itself. I think there's enough value in that alone that it makes the proposition worth it. Moving forward over the next decade, I think charterers will start to make this a requirement, right? They need visibility into the ship operations to maximize profit during this. So I expect that ships with HFD systems and good connectivity will deserve a premium over older vessels in the near future.
I think it's something we definitely see, and not yet, but I think in the foreseeable future that these sorts of systems kind of almost become like a minimum license to operate, as in it's just as you say, the charterers making it something close to mandatory. When you look at the raft of regulations coming down the track around emissions, I think it's very, very difficult to justify not having a kind of high frequency measure on a lot of that stuff. Mike, a question coming your way. For the foreseeable future, ships are operated by humans. There are strict regulations in place to deliver optimum human performance and minimize the risk associated with fatigue-related human error. Is there scope to use HFD with appropriate sensor technology to continuously monitor human performance on the ship for the purpose of maintaining compliance with regulations, reducing burden on the master, all of that sort of stuff? What are your thoughts on that?
As Duncan already said, the ships remains human operated at the moment. and also for the future, I think the crew will be decreased on board, but always there will be human to do the job. So we need to ensure the crew well-being, the regulatory compliance, the operational safety, which is paramount for the companies. So also the sensor-based monitoring can play a crucial role in tracking also crew performance, fatigue levels, and any kind of compliance with manning regulation. We try to do a very attractive environment for the employees on board. The new generation of the crew is very technology oriented. It's social media oriented, let's say. So they're more aware all this with either platforms, either sensor data, and they're very keen to participate as well. So I think that the sensors will try to keep engaged the crew on board. We try to reduce all the administrative burden of the key personnel on board and mitigate all the risks related with human error, because this is what we need. We need to increase efficiency and decrease the risk of any human error.
I just wanted to maybe add,
Go for it, Duncan.
I completely agree, right? So one of the things that you get from a connected HFD system is monitoring adherence to voyage plans and operational profiles. So you notice if there's a problem early, and that may be related to crew fatigue or some other problem, and hopefully it can be addressed quickly. I would say the other thing that is sometimes overlooked is we don't have automated vessels, right? They're not operating by themselves. You need to keep crew engaged and invested in the decisions that are being made. So, you don't even want a crew blindly following onshore directions. You want them thinking and providing feedback and changing operation if it's required for safety or some other performance insight that they see on board. So, again, this is where a really high quality data platform can be valuable, is that it provides that insight both onshore but also to the crew in a way that it builds that engagement and trust between all interested parties.
I think that's really interesting, and certainly, we see that the way ships are being operated today increasingly has particularly the officers moving from doing stuff to monitoring stuff, and actually there is a risk as automation increases that kind of engagement starts to drift off. So it's actually really interesting to hear if you can get the right data in their hands to allow them to make decisions to help improve the performance of the vessel. Actually, the engagement potentially ticks up. Yeah, really interesting. With AI's ever-growing demand for data, it's almost certain that high-frequency data exchange will soon be embedded across the global fleet. This is more a question of when than if. How can we seize this moment and address the standardization challenges in shipping so that as we design and deploy high-frequency data frameworks, we embed industry-wide data standards from the outset instead of having to retrofit them later? I knew data standards would come up. Duncan, what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, yes. So many thoughts on this, mostly from the pain side, right? This is what we spend a lot of time doing, is dealing with disparate data systems and integrating them to provide coherent insights. So yes, a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money is spent on this because there are so many differences between individual vessels, between different companies. I think the time is actually earlier probably to start thinking about standardization across the industry. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear maybe what both of you or the rest of our viewers think about this problem. Yeah.
Mike, what's your view on the whole question around data standards?
I strongly agree with Duncan. The time for standardization, is now. We need to set communities from all the different sectors of the maritime industry, either for the clients, the charterers, the vendors, the regulators. We need to set the standards now and go on. We need to be more innovative, not afraid anymore.
I love it. I like that we're coming out of this session swinging. It's good. I feel like we could probably go on for another hour. I think this is such an interesting topic and set of topics, and we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface with it really. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and we are into the last few minutes here. Mike and Duncan, I really appreciate perhaps just to hear your closing thoughts, and if there's any ship owners, ship operators in the audience who are thinking about HFD, thinking about implementing HFD, or sort of unsure of the path forward, perhaps what's one thing that they should take back into their organizations from this session? Mike, why don't you go first? What's your kind of key takeaway?
Decentralize IT to the business. Engage more of the business to participate in this kind of project. This will be the real success.
That's fascinating. I feel like that's a whole hour in its own right, unpacking that question. Duncan?
Yes. So I think the value of HFD is threefold, right? The obvious thing is that you get data on a higher frequency, and that unlocks visibility. It unlocks operational efficiencies, just that alone. But you get two other things, right? You get data quantity, and as mentioned in one of the questions, data quantity. This is the lifeblood of machine learning and AI algorithms. This is very, very valuable. Just having more data. For example, if you are moving from a noon-based reporting system to a 1-second HFD system, just for a single quantity, right? You have an 80,000-fold increase in the amount of data that you're bringing from that one vessel, right? So that data is so valuable when working with AI right now. And then finally, I think even more fundamental is that HFD data is really improving your data fidelity. You're getting more accurate understanding of the ship condition and the ship operation. And this is really critical, right? We're talking about monitoring, let's say, hull fouling, right? This is a 10-30% increase in power or fuel requirements that evolves over years. This is really quite difficult to see in noon-based data, but much easier to see in HFD data. And that's let's say, a 10-20% decrease in fuel requirements for a ship, and that one step alone, right? So the payoff it can be quite high. There's a lot of money left on the table, and I think it would be a good idea for almost anyone to start investing in their HFD and data environment now.
I like that last word, now. That was actually my closing thought, is that the phrase "the time is now" has been used quite a lot through this session, and I agree with it. But I think the time is now doesn't necessarily mean that you just have to throw everything at this and do a massive fleet-wide rollout straight away. One of my biggest takeaways is actually that one of the most important things you can do is get the right kind of data platform in place and understand how that data is coming in and how it can be used through the organization before you start making heavy investments across the fleet. And I think doing those kinds of counterfactual exercises where you start with a single vessel, then start to roll out as those counterfactuals start to show results, I think is a really interesting way of perhaps de-risking the whole question around ROI. My final takeaway is really around Mike's point about decentralizing IT, and I would say actually around decentralizing the data as well. How far into the organization can you push this data? What decisions can it drive throughout the organization, whether it's related to the voyage management, whether it's related to maintenance, whether it's related to wider decarbonization questions. I think there's a huge amount of value that can be unlocked. We are unfortunately out of time. Mike, Duncan, thank you so much for your time and your insight today. Thank you to all of the team at Danelec for actually commissioning this, I think, quite important piece of research. The good news is, if you found this interesting, you will have either just received or be just about to receive, depending on where you are in the world, a copy of the report to your inbox. So keep an eye out for it. If you have any questions about it, obviously give us a shout. We'd love to talk it through. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope it's been valuable, and very much looking forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
No pleasure.